I thought I knew my brother. For 58 years I believed Bobby was just ambitious, maybe a little selfish, but still family. Then I sat in that lawyer's office 3 days after our father's funeral and heard words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about the man I'd called my little brother. "The entire estate goes to Robert Washington," the attorney read, and in that moment I realized I'd been living with a stranger my whole life. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. The rain was still falling when I walked into Patterson and Associates that Tuesday morning. The same gray drizzle that had been with us since Daddy's funeral 3 days before. I should have taken it as a sign. Bobby was already there, of course, sitting in that leather chair like he owned the place, checking his phone with that familiar impatient look he got when things weren't moving fast enough for him. He looked up when I came in, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Not grief, we'd both cried plenty at the funeral. Something else. Something that made my stomach flutter with unease. "Hey, Maggie," he said, standing up to give me that quick hug he'd been giving me since we were kids. But it felt different somehow, rushed, like he wanted to get through the motions. "Morning, Bobby," I replied, settling into the chair next to him. This feels so strange, doesn't it? Daddy always said he'd handle all this business himself when the time came. Bobby nodded, but he was already looking toward the door where Mr. Patterson was entering with a thick manila folder. "Mrs. Washington, Mr. Washington," the elderly attorney greeted us. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man." I smiled through the sadness. Daddy had been a good man. He'd worked 2 jobs most of his life to keep Bobby and me fed and clothed after Mama passed. He'd never missed a school play or graduation. When I got sick last year and had to take early retirement from teaching, he'd promised me that I'd always have a place in the family home, that I wouldn't have to worry about medical bills eating up my small pension. "Now then," Mr. Patterson continued, adjusting his glasses, "your father's will is quite straightforward. He came in several times over the years to update it, most recently about 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. I felt that flutter in my stomach again. 3 weeks ago, Daddy had been having more of those confused spells. Some days he knew exactly who I was, other days he'd call me by Mama's name or ask when Bobby was coming home from high school. Mr. Patterson opened the folder and began to read. I, Harold James Washington, being of sound mind and body. The legal language washed over me at first. I was thinking about Daddy, about how frail he'd looked in that hospital bed, about how Bobby had only visited twice in those final 2 weeks, while I'd been there every day, holding Daddy's hand and reading him stories from the newspaper. Then I heard the words that changed everything. The entirety of my estate, including the family home at 428 Maple Street, all bank accounts, investments, and personal property I leave to my son Robert James Washington. The room went silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. I felt like I was underwater, like sounds were coming from very far away. This had to be a mistake. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Could you repeat that last part?" Patterson looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Bobby, then back at me. "The estate goes entirely to your brother, Mrs. Washington. There are no other beneficiaries listed." I turned to look at Bobby. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, not meeting my eyes. "Bobby," I whispered, "there has to be some mistake. Daddy always said the house would be mine, that you had your own place, your business." Finally, Bobby looked at me, and that strange expression I'd seen earlier was back. "Maggie, I'm as surprised as you are. Maybe Daddy thought I'd take better care of things. You know, with your health and all." My health, the cancer I'd fought and beaten, the reason I'd had to retire early, the reason Daddy had promised I'd always have a home. Mr. Patterson, I said, my voice shaking now, when exactly did my father make these changes? The attorney checked his notes. The will was revised on March 15th. Your father came in alone that day, March 15th. I remembered that day clearly because it was the day after I'd taken Daddy to the hospital for one of his confused episodes. The day the doctor had quietly told me that Daddy's mind was getting worse, that he was becoming more susceptible to suggestion and confusion. Was there a previous will? I asked. Mr. Patterson nodded. Yes, there was. Made about 5 years ago. But this most recent version supersedes it, of course. Can you tell me what the previous will said? Another uncomfortable glance between the lawyer and my brother. Mrs. Washington, I don't think it's appropriate to discuss previous versions when there's a current, valid will. But Bobby spoke up then, his voice careful and measured. Maggie, I know this is hard. But Daddy made his decision. He knew I could handle the responsibilities better. The house needs work, the finances are complicated. I stared at my brother, this man I'd helped raise after Mama died, who I'd supported through college, who I'd believed loved me, and saw a stranger. Bobby, Daddy promised me that house. He promised I'd be taken care of. You know I can't afford rent anywhere. Not with my medical expenses. Well, figure something out, Bobby said, but his tone was already distant, already moving on. Maybe you can stay there for a few months while you make other arrangements. Other arrangements. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than his sister, who just lost the only parent we had left. I stood up on shaking legs. I need to see that previous will, Mr. Patterson. Mrs. Washington, I really don't think I have a right to know what my father intended before his mind started failing. Bobby's face darkened. His mind wasn't failing, Maggie. And even if it was, this will is legal and binding. I'm sorry you're disappointed, but this is how Daddy wanted it. The way he said it. So final. So prepared. Like he'd been expecting this conversation and had his answers ready. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. But as I sat in my car in the parking lot, rain streaming down the windshield, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Bobby hadn't seemed surprised. Not even a little bit. And that scared me more than losing everything else combined. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw Bobby's face in that lawyer's office, too calm, too prepared, like he'd been rehearsing for this moment. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going back to Daddy's house, my childhood home, to pack up his things. Bobby had given me a week before he needed to start making arrangements, as he put it. A week to say goodbye to the only real home I'd ever known. The spare key was still under the old flower pot by the back door, same place it had been for 30 years. Walking into that empty house felt like stepping into a museum of my own life. Everything was exactly as Daddy had left it. His reading glasses on the kitchen table, his favorite coffee mug in the dish drainer, the crossword puzzle he'd been working on still folded open to the page where he'd gotten stuck. I started in his bedroom, carefully folding his clothes and setting aside the things I thought Bobby might want to keep. That's when I found something that made my hands shake. Hidden behind Daddy's dresser, wedged between the wall and the wood, was a manila envelope. My name was written on it in Daddy's shaky handwriting, for Maggie. Important papers. Inside was a copy of his will, the old will, the one Mr. Patterson hadn't wanted to discuss. I sat down hard on Daddy's bed and read every word. According to this document, dated 5 years ago, everything was to be split equally between Bobby and me, with a special provision that I would inherit the house since my daughter Margaret has given so much of her life caring for family and deserves a secure home. But there was more. At the bottom, in Daddy's handwriting, was a note dated just 2 months ago. Maggie, if anything happens to me and Bobby tries to say I changed my mind about the will, don't believe him. I would never leave you with nothing. Check the lockbox at First National. The combination is your birthday. I love you. Daddy, my birthday, 08-15-62. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. I drove to First National Bank like my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. The safety deposit box contained documents that made my stomach turn. Bank statements showing large withdrawals that I'd never seen before. Receipts for expensive dinners and gifts, all signed by Bobby but charged to Daddy's account. And then I found the most devastating piece of evidence of all. It was a small digital recorder, the kind Daddy used for his grocery lists when his memory started getting fuzzy. But this wasn't a grocery list. I pressed play with trembling fingers and heard my father's voice, weak and confused. "Bobby, I don't understand why I need to sign this. Maggie should get the house, she's been taking care of me." Then Bobby's voice, smooth and patient but with an edge I'd never heard before. "Dad, we talked about this. Maggie can't handle the responsibility. She's sick, remember? You want what's best for her, don't you? This way I can take care of everything and make sure she's provided for." But the lawyer said, "Dad, you're getting confused again. Remember what the doctor said about your memory. You need to trust me on this. I'm looking out for both of us." There was a long pause, then Daddy's voice, smaller now, defeated. "I just want to make sure Maggie's okay. She will be, Dad. I promise. But you need to sign this so I can help her properly." The recording went on for another few minutes, with Bobby patiently wearing down our father's resistance, using his confusion and fear against him. By the end, Daddy sounded exhausted and lost. I sat in that bank parking lot and cried until I had no tears left. This was elder abuse. This was my brother systematically manipulating our sick father for money. But the worst part wasn't the money or even the house. The worst part was the promise Bobby had made at the end of that recording. "I promise I'll take care of Maggie." He'd looked me in the eye that morning and essentially thrown me out on the street. The brother who'd promised our dying father he'd take care of me had given me a week to make other arrangements. When I got home to my small apartment, the place I'd been renting while caring for Daddy, planning to give up once I moved back into our family home, I sat down and really looked at my situation. My teacher's pension barely covered my basic expenses. The cancer treatments had eaten through most of my savings. I had maybe 3 months of rent money left, and that was if I didn't eat much. Bobby knew all of this. He'd helped me figure out my budget when I first got sick. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money or property. This was about power. Bobby had always been the golden child, the successful one. The one Daddy bragged about to his friends. But in the end, when Daddy needed actual care, it had been me. Day after day, night after night, and maybe, for the first time in his life, Daddy had valued what I'd given over what Bobby had achieved. So Bobby had made sure that didn't matter. I picked up the phone and called information. "I need the number for Patterson and Associates," I said. But when I called the law office, I didn't ask for Mr. Patterson. Instead, I asked for something else. "I need to know if you can recommend someone who handles elder abuse cases," I told the receptionist. "Someone who isn't afraid to go up against family." The name she gave me was Sarah Chen, with Chen and Associates. "She's tough," the receptionist said quietly. "And she doesn't back down." I made the appointment for the next morning. As I hung up the phone, I thought about Bobby, probably already making plans to sell Daddy's house. Maybe already spending the money in his head. He'd counted on me being too grief-stricken, too overwhelmed, too trusting to fight back. He was about to learn he'd made a very big mistake. Sarah Chen's office was nothing like Patterson and Associates. Where Patterson's place felt old and stuffy, with dark wood and heavy curtains, Sarah's office was bright and modern. Sunlight streamed through large windows, and the walls were covered with certificates and photos of Sarah with clients who looked like regular people, not wealthy businessmen. Sarah herself was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and confident. "Mrs. Washington," she said. gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. Tell me what's happened. I'd practiced this conversation in my head all night. But sitting there in that sunny office, the words came tumbling out in a rush. I told her about Daddy's confusion, about the will reading, about Bobby's strange behavior. When I got to the part about finding the recording, Sarah leaned forward, her expression sharpening. You have this recording with you? She asked. I pulled out the small digital recorder with shaking hands. I don't know if it's legal evidence or anything, but Sarah took the recorder and listened to the entire thing, her face growing more serious with each passing minute. When it finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Ms. Washington, she finally said, what you've shown me is clear evidence of elder abuse and fraud. Your brother systematically manipulated a vulnerable adult into changing legal documents. This is not just unethical, it's criminal. The word criminal hit me like a physical blow. Criminal meant Bobby could go to jail. Criminal meant our family would be destroyed completely, not just damaged. I don't want to send my brother to prison, I said quietly. I just want what Daddy really intended. I want the truth to matter. Sarah nodded. I understand. And there are ways to handle this that focus on correcting the fraud rather than punishment. Though I should warn you, once we challenge this will, your brother will likely fight back hard. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my dwindling savings, about the stack of medical bills on my kitchen table, about the house where I'd grown up and planned to grow old. I don't have much choice. Actually, you do have choices, Sarah said. We could approach your brother first, privately. Show him what evidence we have, and see if he's willing to negotiate a fair settlement without going to court. You think he might agree to that? Sarah's expression was gentle but realistic. People who commit financial fraud usually prefer to settle quietly rather than have their actions become public record. But Mrs. Washington, I need you to understand, from what you've shown me, your brother has committed serious crimes. If he refuses to make this right, we'll need to involve the authorities. I left Sarah's office with a legal retainer agreement and a plan. Sarah would contact Bobby directly, requesting a meeting to discuss irregularities in the will. She wouldn't mention the recording or the other evidence right away, just enough to let him know we were serious. That afternoon my phone rang. Bobby's name flashed on the screen. Maggie. What the hell is this about a lawyer? His voice was tight with anger. Some woman called my office talking about Dad's will like there's some kind of problem. There is a problem, Bobby, I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. I found Daddy's original will, the one where he left me the house. There was silence on the other end. Then, Maggie, you're upset and grieving. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly. I also found the safety deposit box, Bobby. I know about the money you took from Daddy's account. Another pause, longer this time. When Bobby spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the condescending big brother tone. Now he sounded cold, calculating. Whatever you think you found, Maggie, it doesn't matter. The current will is legal and binding. Dad made his choice. Dad made his choice when he was confused and scared, and you took advantage of that. I took care of Dad. Where were you when he needed help with his bills? When he was confused about his medications? The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I had been working up until my cancer diagnosis. Bobby had been helping with some of Daddy's finances, but that didn't give him the right to steal everything. I was working to support myself so I could take care of him, I said. And when I got sick, I spent every day with him. Every day, Bobby. You visited twice, because I was handling his business affairs. Someone had to be practical while you were playing nursemaid. Playing nursemaid. That's what he called the months I'd spent reading to Daddy, helping him with his physical therapy, holding his hand when he was scared and confused. Bobby, I have evidence. I have recordings. I know what you did. The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, in a voice I'd never heard from my brother before, Low and almost threatening, he said, "Maggie, you need to be very careful here. You're not well, you're grieving, and you're making accusations that could ruin both our lives. Dad left everything to me because he trusted me to make the right decisions. If you try to fight this, I'll have to show everyone how unstable you've been since your diagnosis. The confusion, the memory problems from the chemo, the way you've been obsessing over every little thing." My blood ran cold. The memory problems from chemo were real. I'd struggled with them for months. But Bobby was talking about using them against me, making me look incompetent. "Those problems are gone, Bobby. My doctors cleared me months ago. Are they gone, though? Because this paranoid fantasy about me stealing from Dad sounds a lot like someone who isn't thinking straight." I felt something break inside me then. Not break apart, but break free. This wasn't my little brother anymore. This wasn't family. This was someone willing to destroy me to cover up what he'd done. "I'll see you in court, Bobby," I said and hung up. Within an hour, Sarah Chen called me back. "Mrs. Washington, I just got off the phone with your brother's attorney. He's hired Robert Hartman, one of the most expensive estate lawyers in the state. He's not planning to negotiate." "What does that mean?" "It means he's going to fight this with everything he has. And Mrs. Washington, Mr. Hartman is already asking questions about your mental health, your cancer treatment, your financial situation. Your brother is preparing to paint you as an unstable woman trying to steal an inheritance." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, looking at the stack of medical bills that proved just how financially desperate I really was. "Can he win with that strategy?" Sarah's voice was gentle but honest. "He's going to try. But Mrs. Washington, we have something he doesn't expect us to have." "What's that?" "The truth. And a recording of him committing a crime. When we play that in court, all his expensive lawyers and character assassination won't matter." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my brother hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd forced me to see who he really was, and now he was trying to make me doubt my own sanity to cover it up. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't afraid. I was angry, and anger, I was learning, could be a very powerful thing. The court papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a serious-looking young man who made me sign for them like they were made of gold. Bobby was contesting our challenge to the will, just as Sarah had predicted. But what I wasn't prepared for was how vicious his response would be. According to the documents, I was financially desperate cancer patient with documented cognitive impairment who had become obsessed with her father's estate due to her own precarious mental and financial state. The papers claimed I had manipulated and pressured Daddy in his final months and was now fabricating evidence to steal what rightfully belonged to Bobby. Reading those words felt like being slapped. This was how my own brother saw me, or at least, how he was willing to portray me to win. Sarah had warned me this was coming, but seeing it in black and white legal language made it real in a way that hurt deeper than I expected. "Remember," Sarah told me when I called her, crying, "desperate people do desperate things. The fact that he's attacking you so viciously tells me he knows how strong our evidence is. He's trying to discredit you before we can present the recording." "But what if it works? What if the judge believes him?" "Mrs. Washington, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen judges hear evidence that proves the truth beyond any doubt. Your brother can hire the most expensive lawyers in the state, but he can't change what's on that recording." The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Bobby's lawyers were doing everything they could to make my life miserable. They demanded access to all my medical records, my financial statements, even my employment records from the school district. They wanted to prove I was desperate enough to lie and too confused to be trusted. But Sarah was busy too. She'd hired a private investigator named Marcus, a quiet man in his 50s who'd worked as a police detective for 20 years. Within a week, Marcus had uncovered things about Bobby's business dealings that made my stomach turn. Your brother's real estate company has been struggling for the past 2 years, Marcus reported during a meeting at Sarah's office. He's got 3 lawsuits pending from clients who say he misrepresented properties. His business partner filed a complaint with the state licensing board. And Mrs. Washington, he's been borrowing heavily against his own house. So he needed Daddy's money? I said. More than needed it. He was desperate for it. I found records of him asking your father for loans going back 18 months. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Sarah leaned forward. This establishes motive. He wasn't just being greedy. He was in serious financial trouble. But the most damaging discovery came from an unexpected source. Marcus had been interviewing Daddy's neighbors, trying to build a timeline of events leading up to the will change. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door to Daddy for 30 years, had something important to tell us. Your brother came by a lot in those final months, she said when Marcus brought her to Sarah's office. But he never came when you were there, Mrs. Washington. Always when you were at work or running errands. And I heard them arguing sometimes, loud arguments. What kind of arguments? Sarah asked. Mrs. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. Your father would get upset. Say things like, that's not what I want, and Maggie should have the house. But your brother, he was very patient, very calm. He'd keep talking until your father got quiet. Sometimes I'd see your father afterward, sitting on the porch looking defeated. This was exactly what Sarah needed to prove a pattern of manipulation. But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't finished. The worst part, she continued, was about a month before your father passed. I saw your brother leaving the house with a stack of papers, and your father was crying on the porch. Actually crying. Like his heart was broken. I went over to check on him, and he said, I think I just signed away Maggie's future, but Bobby says it's for the best. I didn't understand what he meant then. But now, I had to excuse myself and step outside. The image of Daddy crying on his porch, confused and manipulated by his own son, was too much to bear. When I came back inside, Sarah was finishing up with Mrs. Rodriguez. After she left, Sarah turned to me with a serious expression. Mrs. Washington, what we have here is overwhelming evidence of elder abuse. The financial records, the witness testimony, the recording, any one of these things would be strong evidence. Together they paint a picture that no jury could ignore. So we'll win. I believe we will. But I need to warn you about something. Your brother's lawyer called this morning. He wants to settle. I felt my heart skip. Settle? What kind of settlement? Has offering to give you the house and $20,000 from your father's savings. You'd sign an agreement never to pursue criminal charges, and both sides would agree not to discuss the case publicly. At $20,000, it would pay my medical bills and give me a little cushion. And I'd have the house, which was really all I'd wanted in the beginning, but something about it felt wrong. What would Bobby keep? I asked. Everything else. The bulk of your father's savings, his investments, his life insurance policy. We estimate he'd still walk away with about $200,000. $200,000. Money he'd stolen by manipulating our dying father. Sarah, what do you think I should do? She was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Washington, I can't make this decision for you, but I will say this. If you settle, your brother keeps most of what he stole, and he never faces any consequences for what he did to your father. That night, I sat in my small apartment, looking at photos of Daddy. In every picture he was smiling, proud of his children, proud of the family he'd built after Mama died. He'd worked so hard to take care of us, to make sure we'd be okay after he was gone. Bobby's settlement offer would give me security, but it would also let him profit from elder abuse. It would send the message that as long as you steal from family and don't get caught immediately, you get to keep most of what you took. But more than that, it would mean that Daddy's last wishes, his real wishes, The ones he'd expressed before Bobby confused and manipulated him wouldn't matter. I picked up the phone and called Sarah. "I've made my decision," I told her. "We're going to court. All the way to court. Are you sure? It's going to get uglier before it gets better." I looked at the photo of Daddy holding me at my college graduation, both of us grinning like we'd conquered the world. "I'm sure," I said. "Daddy deserves justice, and I'm going to make sure he gets it." As I hung up the phone, I realized something had changed in me over the past few weeks. The scared, overwhelmed woman who'd walked out of that lawyer's office was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone who was ready to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Bobby was about to learn that he'd picked the wrong sister to mess with. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected. I'd seen courtrooms on TV shows, grand places with high ceilings and dramatic lighting. This was just a regular room with fluorescent lights and worn carpet, but walking through those doors felt like stepping into the most important moment of my life. Bobby was already there with his lawyer, Robert Hartman, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. Bobby wouldn't look at me, which was probably for the best. I wasn't sure what I'd see in his eyes anymore, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Judge Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and kind but sharp eyes. She'd been on the bench for 20 years, Sarah had told me, and she had a reputation for fairness but no patience for nonsense. "Your Honor," Hartman began when it was his turn to present, "this case is unfortunate but simple. We have a grieving daughter who cannot accept her father's final wishes. Mrs. Washington has been through tremendous stress, cancer, financial difficulties, the caregiving burden, and that stress has led her to construct an elaborate fantasy rather than face the reality that her father chose to leave his estate to the child he felt could best manage it." Hartman painted a picture of me that was technically true, but felt like a phonehouse mirror version of reality. Yes, I'd had cancer. Yes, I'd struggled financially. Yes, the chemo had caused some temporary cognitive issues. But the way he presented it made me sound like a delusional woman who'd lost touch with reality. Mrs. Washington's own medical records show documented memory problems during her treatment. He continued. Her financial records show increasing desperation. And now she claims to have found evidence that mysteriously appeared just when she needed it most. Your Honor, this is not evidence. This is the desperate attempt of a financially ruined woman to steal from her brother. When it was Sarah's turn, she stood up calmly and walked to the center of the courtroom. She didn't have Hartman's theatrical flair, but there was something solid and reassuring about her presence. Your Honor, she said, Miss Hartman has painted an elaborate picture of my client's supposed mental state while ignoring the actual evidence in this case. We're not here to debate Mrs. Washington's medical history or financial situation. We're here because Harold Washington, a vulnerable elderly man with documented cognitive decline, was systematically manipulated into changing his will against his true wishes. Sarah started with the financial records, showing Bobby's pattern of borrowing from Daddy, his business troubles, his desperate need for money. She presented Mrs. Rodriguez's testimony about the arguments and Daddy's tears. She showed the original will with Daddy's handwritten note. Hartman objected to everything, but Judge Morrison allowed most of it, taking notes and asking pointed questions that made me think she was taking this seriously. Then came the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. Your Honor, Sarah said, I'd like to present audio evidence that will demonstrate exactly how Mr. Robert Washington manipulated his vulnerable father. The small digital recorder sat on the evidence table like a bomb waiting to go off. Sarah had connected it to speakers so everyone in the courtroom could hear clearly. This recording was made by Harold Washington himself, Sarah explained. He had begun recording conversations because of his memory issues, as recommended by his doctors. When Sarah pressed play, Daddy's voice filled the courtroom, weak and confused but undeniably real. I watched Bobby's face as his own voice came through the speakers, patient and manipulative, wearing down our father's resistance step by step. The courtroom was completely silent except for the recording. I saw Judge Morrison lean forward, her expression growing more serious with each exchange. I saw Hartman's confident demeanor crack as he realized how damning this evidence was. But it was Bobby's reaction that broke my heart all over again. He wasn't looking shocked or ashamed. He was looking angry. Angry that he'd been caught. Angry that Daddy had recorded him. Angry that his careful plan was falling apart. When the recording ended, the silence stretched for what felt like forever. Judge Morrison was the first to speak. "Mr. Hartman, do you have any questions about the authenticity of this recording?" Hartman looked like he'd been punched. "Your Honor, we would need time to have our experts examine. The recording will be examined," Judge Morrison said firmly. "But for now, I'm going to ask Mr. Robert Washington to take the stand." I watched my brother walk to the witness stand, and for just a moment, he looked like the little boy I'd helped raise. But that illusion shattered the moment Hartman began questioning him. Bobby's testimony was smooth and rehearsed. He painted himself as the responsible son who'd been managing Daddy's affairs because I was too sick to help. He claimed Daddy had come to him voluntarily, worried about my ability to handle an inheritance. He even managed to make his manipulation sound like protection. "My father was concerned about Margaret's judgment," he said, not looking at me. He'd seen how the cancer treatment had affected her thinking. He wanted to make sure the estate would be handled properly, that Margaret would be taken care of without the burden of managing property and finances. It was a believable story if you didn't know the truth. Bobby had always been good with words, good at making himself look reasonable and caring. Then it was Sarah's turn to cross-examine him. "Mr. Washington," she began, "you testified that your father came to you with concerns about your sister's judgment. When exactly did these conversations begin?" "I don't remember the exact dates, but several months before he passed." "Interesting, because according to your father's medical records, his own cognitive decline wasn't diagnosed until January of this year. But you were already borrowing money from his accounts as early as October of last year. Can you explain that?" Bobby shifted in his seat. "I was helping him manage his finances. He asked me to." "I see. And this help included taking $12,000 from his savings account in November, marked as a loan, that was never repaid." "That was a business investment. Dad wanted to help with my company." Sarah pulled out a document. "This is a promissory note your father signed for that loan. It clearly states the money was to be repaid within 6 months. That deadline passed 8 months ago. Did you repay the loan?" "The estate matters were more complicated then. It's a yes or no question, Mr. Washington. Did you repay the $12,000 you borrowed from your elderly father?" Bobby's jaw tightened. "No." "And the $8,000 you took in December? And the $15,000 in February? Were any of these loans repaid?" "No, but..." "So you took $35,000 from your father's accounts, never repaid any of it, and then convinced him to leave you his entire estate. Is that correct?" Hartman was objecting, but Judge Morrison was allowing the questions, and I could see why. Bobby was unraveling before our eyes. "I was trying to help my father make responsible decisions," Bobby said, his voice rising. "Margaret was in no condition to handle financial responsibility. Someone had to think clearly, Mr. Washington. In the recording we heard earlier, your father specifically said Maggie should get the house, and expressed confusion about signing documents. In your opinion, does that sound like someone who came to you voluntarily asking to disinherit his daughter?" Bobby was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his mask had completely slipped. "My father was old and confused. I did what was best for everyone." "Best for everyone? Or best for you?" "Objection!" Hartman shouted. But it was too late. Bobby exploded. "I spent years managing his affairs while she played nursemaid. I kept him out of financial trouble while she fed him soup and read him stories I deserved. He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just said, but the damage was done. You deserved your father's estate, Sarah pressed. Even if it meant leaving your sister homeless. Bobby looked directly at me for the first time since this all began, and what I saw in his eyes was pure resentment. She never contributed anything real. I built a business, I made something of myself. All she did was hold his hand while he was dying. The courtroom was dead silent. In trying to justify himself, Bobby had revealed exactly who he really was. Someone who saw love and caregiving as worthless, who believed financial success gave him the right to steal from his own father. Judge Morrison called a recess, but I barely heard her. I was staring at my brother, finally understanding that the person I'd loved and protected and worried about my whole life had never really existed. The man sitting in that witness chair was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something like peace. Because whatever happened next, the truth was finally out. Judge Morrison returned from recess looking like she'd made up her mind. The 20 minutes we'd waited felt like hours, and I'd spent every moment watching Bobby slumped in his chair, no longer the confident businessman who'd walked into court that morning. After reviewing all the evidence presented, Judge Morrison began, her voice clear and firm, including the audio recording, financial records, and witness testimony. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of elder abuse and fraud. I felt Sarah's hand squeeze mine, but I couldn't take my eyes off the judge. Harold Washington's original will clearly expressed his intentions to provide for both his children, with special consideration for his daughter's housing needs due to her caregiving role. The evidence shows that Robert Washington systematically manipulated his vulnerable father, exploiting the elder Mr. Washington's cognitive decline for financial gain. Judge Morrison looked directly at Bobby. Mr. Washington, your actions constitute elder financial abuse under state law. You took advantage of your father's diminished capacity to serve your own interests, and in doing so, you violated not only the law but the sacred trust between a parent and child. Bobby's expensive lawyer was taking notes frantically, probably already planning an appeal, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. This court hereby invalidates the will dated March 15th and reinstates Harold Washington's original will dated 5 years prior. Furthermore, this court orders Robert Washington to make full restitution for all funds improperly taken from his father's accounts, plus interest and penalties. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo forever. It was over. I had won. But as I sat there listening to Sarah explain the next steps, the paperwork, the timeline for Bobby to vacate Daddy's house, the process for recovering the stolen money, I felt strangely empty. This should have been a moment of triumph, but all I felt was tired and sad. Mrs. Washington, Sarah was saying, "Are you all right?" I looked across the courtroom where Bobby was having a heated whispered conversation with his lawyer. Hartman was shaking his head, clearly unhappy with whatever Bobby was suggesting. Then Bobby stood up and walked toward me. For a moment I thought he might apologize. Despite everything, some small part of me hoped that seeing the truth laid out so starkly might have brought back the brother I remembered. Instead, he stopped a few feet away and said, "I hope you're happy, Maggie. You've destroyed our family over money." The accusation hit me like a slap. I destroyed our family. Bobby, you stole from our dying father. I managed his affairs. I made hard decisions while you played pretend that everything was fine. And now you've made it so we can never be family again. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 62 years. We stopped being family the day you decided to manipulate Daddy into changing his will. We stopped being family the day you looked at me and decided I deserved nothing. Bobby's face flushed red. You always thought you were so much better than me. The perfect daughter, the teacher, the caregiver. But where did it get you? Broken, sick, and alone. It got me the ability to sleep at night, I said quietly. Can you say the same? For just a moment something flickered in Bobby's eyes. Shame, maybe, or regret. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold anger I'd learned to recognize. This isn't over, he said. I'll appeal. I'll fight this until Mr. Washington. Judge Morrison's voice cut through our conversation. She was still at the bench, having heard every word. I strongly advise you to consult with your attorney before making any statements about further legal action. And I should mention that the district attorney's office will be receiving a copy of today's proceedings, including the audio evidence of your manipulation of a vulnerable adult. The color drained from Bobby's face. Criminal charges. He could actually go to jail. Hartman was at his side immediately, pulling him away from me and toward the exit. Don't say another word, I heard him hiss. As they left, Bobby turned back one more time. The look he gave me was pure hatred, and I realized that any hope I'd harbored for reconciliation was gone forever. Are you okay? Sarah asked gently. I watched my brother disappear through the courthouse doors, probably forever. I think I am, I said, surprised to realize it was true. 2 weeks later, I was standing in the kitchen of my childhood home, my home now, making coffee in Daddy's old percolator. The house felt different somehow, both familiar and strange. It would take time to make it feel like mine again rather than just a place I was visiting. Sarah had called that morning with an update. Bobby's appeal had been denied. The district attorney had decided not to pursue criminal charges in exchange for Bobby's full cooperation in making restitution and his agreement to never contest the will again. He'd already moved out of state, she said, probably to avoid the shame of everyone knowing what he'd done. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Mrs. Rodriguez was standing on the porch with a covered dish and a warm smile. Welcome home, Mija, she said, using the affectionate term she'd called me since I was little. I made too much casserole again. As we sat at Daddy's kitchen table sharing lunch, Mrs. Rodriguez told me about the neighbors who'd been asking about me, about the garden club that wanted to know if I'd like to join, about the literacy program at the library that needed volunteer tutors. You know, she said as she was getting ready to leave, your father would be so proud of you, not just for fighting for what was right, but for the way you fought, with dignity. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, really looking at it for the first time since moving back in. There were repairs that needed to be made, rooms that needed updating. It would take most of the restitution money Bobby was paying back, but it would be worth it. In Daddy's bedroom, my bedroom now, I found the old photo albums Mama had kept. Pictures of Bobby and me as children, building snowmen and opening Christmas presents, laughing and playing like the best friends we used to be. I cried looking at those pictures, mourning not just the brother I'd lost, but the illusion I'd held on to for so long. The Bobby in those photos had been real once, I think. But somewhere along the way, ambition and entitlement had eaten away at whatever goodness he'd had until there was nothing left but resentment and greed. That evening I called Sarah to thank her again. Mrs. Washington, can I ask you something? She said. Do you regret it? Fighting so hard, I mean. You could have taken the settlement and avoided all the pain of learning who your brother really was. I thought about it for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the sunset over the backyard where Bobby and I had played as children. No, I said finally. The truth is always better than a lie, even when it hurts. Daddy deserved to have his real wishes honored, and I deserved to know who my brother really was, even if I didn't like the answer. As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. The house was quiet around me, filled with memories both happy and sad, but it was mine now. Daddy's final gift to me wasn't just a roof over my head, it was the knowledge that love and loyalty still mattered, that doing the right thing still counted for something. Tomorrow I'd start the repairs, maybe plant some flowers in Mama's old garden. I'd begin building a new life in this old house, one that honored the family we used to be while accepting the reality of who we'd become. But tonight, I was just going to sit in Daddy's chair and be grateful for the truth, painful as it was, because the truth had set me free. 6 months later, I was kneeling in Mama's old flower garden, my hands deep in the rich soil, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see Sarah Chen walking toward me, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen from her since we first met. "Mrs. Washington," she called out, "I have news." I brushed the dirt off my hands and stood up, my knees protesting a little more than they used to. The garden was coming along beautifully, roses where Mama used to grow them, vegetables in neat rows like Daddy always preferred. It felt good to have my hands in the earth again, to be creating something instead of fighting for something. "Good news or bad news?" I asked, though Sarah's expression suggested I didn't need to worry. "The best news," she said, handing me the envelope. "Bobby's final restitution payment came through this morning. Every penny he stole from your father has been returned, with interest. You're officially made whole again." I opened the envelope and stared at the bank statement. It was more money than I'd seen in my account in years, enough to finish the house repairs, enough to feel secure for the first time since my cancer diagnosis. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I heard through legal circles that Bobby's moved to Arizona, started over with a new business. Apparently, word is he's doing well." I felt a complex mix of emotions at that news. Relief that he was okay, sadness that we'd never speak again, and something that might have been forgiveness, though I wasn't quite ready to call it that yet. "I'm glad he's doing well," I said, and meant it. I never wanted him to be destroyed, just held accountable. Sarah nodded. "You know, I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever had a client handle a situation like this with more grace than you did." After Sarah left, I went back to my garden, but my mind was on the conversation. Grace. I'd never thought of what I'd done as graceful. It had felt messy and painful and necessary. But maybe that's what grace looked like sometimes, doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything you thought you knew about the people you love. The phone rang as I was washing up for dinner. It was Jessica Miller from the literacy program at the library. "Margaret, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to thank you again for volunteering with our adult reading program. Maria specifically asked if you'd be her tutor again next session." Maria was a 60-year-old grandmother who'd never learned to read properly as a child. Teaching her had been one of the most rewarding experiences of my retirement. "Of course," I said. "I'd love to continue working with her." "Wonderful. And Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but whatever you went through this past year, it's made you an even better teacher. There's a wisdom in you now that our students respond to." After I hung up, I thought about Jessica's words. Whatever you went through this past year, it had been a year of loss and betrayal, of fighting for truth and justice, of learning that sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us deepest. But it had also been a year of discovering my own strength, of finding allies in unexpected places, of learning that standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's hard. That evening, I was sitting on the front porch, the same porch where Daddy used to sit in the evenings, where Mrs. Rodriguez had seen him crying after Bobby manipulated him, when my neighbor Tom walked over with his dog. "Evening, Margaret," he said. "Garden's looking beautiful." "Thank you. It's been good therapy." Tom nodded knowingly. He was a widower himself, understood something about starting over after loss. "You know, my late wife always said that the most beautiful gardens grow in soil that's been broken up and turned over. All that disruption makes room for new growth." After he left, I sat there thinking about broken soil and new growth, about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us create space for better things to take root. I thought about Bobby, probably sitting on his own porch somewhere in Arizona, maybe wondering if he'd made the right choices. I hoped he was finding peace in his new life. I hoped he'd learned something from what we'd both been through. As the sun set over the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where I'd planned to grow old, I realized that despite everything that had happened, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The house around me was more than just wood and brick. It was the physical manifestation of Daddy's love, his desire to see me safe and cared for. Bobby had tried to steal that from me, but in the end love had won, truth had won, justice had won. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom to sunlight streaming through windows I'd cleaned myself, in a house that was truly mine, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a fight well fought. I made coffee in Daddy's old percolator and sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper, something I hadn't been able to afford to do when I was struggling to pay rent and medical bills. Such a simple pleasure, but it felt like luxury. On the kitchen counter was a card from my former student Maria. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she'd written, "Dear Mrs. Washington, thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to learn new things. Your courage inspires me every day." Courage. I'd never thought of myself as particularly courageous. I'd just done what needed to be done, stood up for what was right, refused to let injustice win. But maybe that's what courage really is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to do the right thing despite the fear. Not the lack of pain, but the choice to seek truth even when the truth hurts. As I sat there in my kitchen in my house, surrounded by the life I'd fought so hard to protect, I realized that the story wasn't really about money or property, or even family betrayal. It was about discovering that sometimes losing the people we thought we knew is the only way to find out who we really are. It was about learning that love isn't always enough to change people, but it's always enough to sustain us while we do what's right. It was about understanding that the greatest inheritance our parents can leave us isn't money or property. It's the values that guide us when everything else falls apart. And sitting there in the morning light, surrounded by peace I'd fought so hard to earn, I knew that Daddy would be proud. Not just because I'd won, but because I'd won the right way, with truth and dignity and grace. The battle was over, the truth had prevailed, and I was finally truly home.